Okay, connective tissues. We talked a little bit yesterday about loose connective tissue, also called areolar, A-R-E-O-L-A-R, connective tissue, also called connective tissue proper. 3 different names for the exact same thing.
I don't think we made it this far. I don't think we made it. I think we're back 1, 2, 3. I stopped highlighting 3 slides ago.
Yeah, I think we did.
We didn't go over that one.
We didn't go over reticular fibers.
We did that one because you said we'll never see it on a regular slide.
Unless, yeah, but we have a lot of slides over there that are stained for reticular tissue, so you will see it. Elastic fibers, they're just stretchy. Okay, they're the thin black ones that you saw. And the ground substance is the clear stuff in between.
Yeah, that's where we ended.
Which puts us right here, which is where we're starting.
Oh. I was looking
No
at
problem.
that slide.
Okay. Adipose tissue. Another name for adipose tissue is fat cells. That's right. A couple of points here. Fat cells, we don't really make any more fat cells after we're little bitty babies. We sort of have the number of fat cells we're going to have the rest of our life. And so the point is, don't get your babies fat. Okay? It's so cute to see these fat little babies that have big old cheeks and pudgy little arms and so forth. But just to let you know, those kids are going to struggle with their weight the rest of their life if they do that. Because they will establish a large number of fat cells, and they can get bigger and expand, and they can shrink as they go on diets and try to lose weight. But if you have a whole lot of fat cells, it's a whole lot easier to gain weight than if you don't. So we're probably better staying thin our whole life. Otherwise, we fight our weight our whole life. So keep that in mind. Mesenchymal cells are, what are mesenchymal cells? They're like stem cells. That's right. They can turn into a bunch of things. Mesenchymal cells divide early in life to form fat cells, and you can make more fat cells later in life, but that's not very common. And because, like I said, we pretty much start elementary school with the number of fat cells we're going to have. Question, yeah.
When I was reading the text, I got a little bit confused. So, and I probably won't pronounce these right, the areolar tissue.
Areolar tissue, yeah.
Tissue, it gets overrun with like the mesenchymal cells and then becomes adipose. Is that?
Well, it can, yeah. If you're eating too much and you're storing, you need a place to store it, then the mesenchymal cells will produce more fat cells if they're needed to store the extra fat.
But the areolar turn into fat cells?
Areolar just means loose tissue. Areolar means there's spaces in between. So forth. Yeah. Okay, so that's fat cells. I think I did mention the fat cells look like signet rings, S-I-G-N-E-T, rings that are the rings that you have that have a bulge on one side, and the rest of them is just a big empty hole to store the fat. Did I talk about that the other day? Okay. On the other hand, reticular tissue is tissues like, examples would be, down here at the bottom, spleen, liver, lymph nodes, and bone marrow. Now, what does that mean? Because you're not really familiar with those tissues yet, but just know that reticular tissues are soft, but yet they have structure and shape. So like a lymph node, even though it's maybe 3/4 of a centimeter in diameter, and it's pretty soft, and if you squeezed it, it would just go away, and you'd smush it completely away. But nonetheless, in the body, normally it just sits there and it has a nice round shape and has a covering and has all these reticular fibers in it. And the reticular fibers, I always like to think of as they just all connect to each other to kind of hold things up, so it doesn't crush in on itself. And so the spleen, the liver, lymph nodes, and bone marrow are all reticular tissue, and the reason they're called reticular tissue is because they have a lot of reticular fibers. Okay. Now, whereas as we saw earlier, wow, I went from 0 pins to 20. That's good. Remember, the elastic fibers are really thin and black and long, and they stretch and all that good stuff. And then remember, the collagen fibers are kind of wide and long, and they're strong too, but only in the direction in which they pull. And so when we get to things like tendons and ligaments, they're made up of real zillions of these collagenous fibers, and you'll see them, they're all lined up together. Whereas reticular fibers are kind of like this, and they kind of build a network of tissue, of fibers to hold things up and maintain a three-dimensional organization to it. Like what? Like a web, yeah. Now, as I told you the other day, you won't see reticular fibers on any of the H&E stains, the pink and blue stains that most all of our slides are stained with. That's the two dyes, hematoxylin and eosin are the blue and the red dyes. And because the reticular fibers don't take up those stains. But we do have a number of slides over there in the lab that you should look at, and they're called reticular slides. And some of them have been stained for the reticular fibers. And once you look at them, you won't ever forget them. They're real easy to identify once you've seen them. But just remember, you may see reticular tissue, like a lymph node or like the spleen, and we will see those later as we go through the course, but you won't see the reticular fibers unless the fibers are stained for specifically. Does that make sense? Okay. Going back to fat cells, here's an example of fat tissue. It's a big glob of fat with a nucleus over on the side. That's where it gets that name, signet cell. Not really the best example. Maybe this one right here. It's kind of a signet cell with the nucleus over on the side. What is the function? This is funny. What are the locations of fat deep to the skin, especially at the sides, buttocks, breasts, padding around the eyes and kidneys? It's found everywhere. I'll just tell you. And some of us have a lot more than others. What are the functions of fat tissue? Well, it provides padding. Isn't that nice? It cushions against shocks. It does insulate us against heat, and you'll probably notice in the winter time that people that are heavier don't have to bundle up as much. At least they usually don't. And that's because they have their own insulation. They don't need that down jacket. The other thing about these fat cells is they're really helpful in a crisis because you've got all this energy that you can use and burn. Even if you're on a starvation diet, it should get you through a few months if you have a fair amount of it. Remember that a lot of the slides look like this, and you can see the globule of fat, but on a lot of slides, it'll look like this. And what this means is that in the staining process, this is a drawing, this is an actual slide. In the staining process, the globules of fat were actually dissolved away. So you don't see them, they just look like empty spaces. Okay? Look at a couple fat slides and you'll have that down too. Here's an example of the reticular fibers that are stained for reticular tissue. And so you can see all of these branched and short reticular fibers in it. And here's another example, even more clearly stained for. Okay, next one. So we've covered adipose, and we've covered reticular, and prior to that we covered loose areolar tissue. Okay, going on. Dense connective tissue. Dense connective tissue is tightly packed. It's got lots of collagen fibers, and it can be one of three forms, really. Dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Okay? Now, think about those three names, and they'll make sense to you real easy. Dense regular means it's dense, so there's lots and lots. It's not loose like that areolar tissue, remember, that had all that ground substance and space in between. It was the crinkly stuff that we talked about from dissection. But dense regular is just completely packed with collagen fibers, and they are regular. They're all going in one direction, because collagen fibers really only have strength in the direction of their length. Okay, so dense regular is what makes up tendons, which is what attaches our muscles to our bones, and ligaments. Ligaments attach one bone to the next bone. Dense irregular is just as tough, and it has just as many collagen fibers, but they're running at all kinds of different layers. So if you want to think about that, one good place to think about that is like in the abdominal wall. On the outside of the muscles, there's this dense, irregular connective tissue that provides strength in all directions. It kind of acts as a sheath for the muscles. And if you are so lucky to have a six-pack of abdominal muscles, the reason you have that six-pack is because of this dense, irregular connective tissue that kind of attaches to the back side, basically, and gives you those inscriptions, we call them, the transverse lines. We'll come back to that. The third type of dense connective tissue is called elastic tissue, and we only find this in a couple places in the body. I think the best example that the book offers, and I think we have slides of this, are examples of the ligaments that connect the vertebrae back here in your neck. So they stretch, but they always come back to where they started. Examples in a second here. So let's go to dense regular. Dense regular, they're tightly packed, they're parallel, and you should know these three terms, what these three terms mean. Tendons are what attach muscles to bones. Ligaments are what connect bones to bones. And aponeuroses attach in sheets to large flat muscles. And the one I was giving you the example of there is the abdominal muscles, which are covered by that kind of white sheet of tough fascia that you saw on your rats. Aponeurosis, or aponeuroses. So here's what dense regular looks like. This would be an example from this tendon back here. That's attaching the triceps muscle to the elbow, to the olecranon, and it makes your arm, when you pull on your triceps muscle, it makes your arm go out. Anybody ever go do a weight class, and they have you grab this weight in your hand and hold it back here, and they say, okay, 1, 2, 3. And you're basically stressing in your triceps muscle here on the back of your arm is the one doing the work to make that movement. Now, just so you know, the other one that you often do in a weight class would be biceps curls, where you take the weight in your arm and you do this with it, okay? And the muscle that's doing that work is this one up front, and it's pulling up on this bone right here, just past the joint, and you're lifting. As a little note, your biceps is usually about 4 times stronger than your triceps. So even though I can biceps curl 45 pounds or so, I can triceps curl about 10 or 12. That's about it. I can try. The point being that in this dense regular, everything is going in the same direction. They're tightly packed together, and about the only cells you see in there are fibroblasts. Fibroblasts, remember, make fibers, and these are collagen fibers. Dense irregular, now remember, dense regular only pulls in one direction. Dense irregular is pulling in all directions. So we have dense irregular in lots of places, including right in our skin. That makes our skin tough and allows us to pull in all directions on our skin without our skin pulling apart, because we have layers of dense irregular connective tissue in it. We also find it around the cartilages, and around the cartilages we call that perichondrium. Okay? Chondro refers to cartilage. Remember the hypochondriac region here, which was under the cartilage? Perichondrium. We also find it around all the bones. We call it periosteum. Osteo refers to bone. Osteomyelitis, osteomalacia, osteofibrosis, all kinds of osteo things related to bones. And then dense irregular forms a capsule around some organs, like the liver and the kidney. Whereas the liver itself is all reticular tissue inside, there is a tough layer around the outside of it, which is made up of this, dense irregular, like around the kidney and the liver, that kind of helps hold them together and gives them some strength from outside trauma. Did I see a hand? Okay. So here's an example of what these look like. Here's what dense irregular looks like. And you can, just looking at this, you can figure that there's fibers going this way, fibers coming straight out at us, fibers going in all directions. That's dense irregular connective tissue. One of the places you'll find it is down here in the deep dermis, the deeper layers of the skin. But you really find it in all kinds of tissue, even deep down in from the surface of the urinary bladder to keep the bladder from stretching too much. It's in all the intestines to keep them from stretching too much, and so forth. Once again, it's primarily collagen. Elastic tissue is made up of elastic fibers, and like I said, this is really the only one that the book gives us, is the example of the elastic ligaments in the spinal vertebrae that hold our vertebrae. It allows them to move a little bit, but it doesn't allow them to move too much. We wouldn't want our head to fall off, obviously. Here's what elastic tissue looks like. Here's an example of where it's found between the different vertebrae, just to stabilize the vertebrae. Oh, it also occurs in the penis here, it looks like. Wow. I'll have to look for that next time. Cushions shocks, permits expansion and contraction of organs. The nice thing about elastic fibers is they do stretch, but they do come back. Okay? All right. So that's the connective tissues that you probably think of as connective tissues, because they connect things together and hold them and strengthen them. Let's talk about the fluid connective tissues now. There's basically just 2 of them. We will spend the whole chapter on blood in 232. The 2 connective tissues are blood and lymph. You guys have probably all seen blood, but you've probably never seen lymph. Lymph is a clear fluid that your body is continually trying to get rid of because it just tends, especially in your legs, it tends to leak out into the tissues. You've all seen patients that have edema of their legs, and their legs are real swollen, and they may wear support stockings, they may take water pills trying to get rid of that extra water, that they have swelling. And that's usually a sign that their lymphatic system, which is an entirely separate set of tubes, lymph vessels, are not working right. So, yes,
Could Graves' disease cause that?
Graves,
Yeah.
not that I'm aware of. Graves' disease is a thyroid disorder
Yeah.
that makes you overactive, gives you bug eyes. Not that I'm aware of, but I'm sure it could, because it can lead to heart failure. Graves' disease can. So blood and lymph both are mostly water. They're mostly water. In blood, we call it serum, right? And so in that serum, that watery matrix of blood has a lot of proteins in it that do a lot of things for us. Everything from fight infections to clot the blood to all kinds of stuff we'll learn about later. But just remember that blood has two major parts. One is called the formed elements. So if this is a test tube here, and we fill it up with blood, and then we put it in a centrifuge and we spin it down, what we'll be looking at then is a tube that kind of looks like this. And this is red, deep red down here looking. There's a little, we call this the buffy coat, which is kind of yellowish tissue. This is, and then this up here is clear and it's yellow. Clear and yellow. And so this is the serum up here. This is the formed elements down here. Includes all of these. The formed elements are 99.9% of the formed elements are red cells. Okay, that's really what our blood's all about, is carrying red cells that carry oxygen around to our body. But it has a few other things in there, to the grand total of about 1/10 of 1%. And that consists of the white cells called leukocytes. Red cells are called erythrocytes. Erythro means red. Really complicated. And the white cells, which are called leuko. Leuko means white in one of those old man's languages that's not spoken much anymore. Latin or Greek. Yeah.
I wanted to touch on that. It's kind of like I do double red donations.
Yeah.
I see the machine actually
Pulls out whole blood.
Yeah, pulls out whole blood, separates the plasma, and that's exactly what that is, right?
That's right. They give you the plasma back.
Yeah, and the way I remember it, it's like one looks like a frothy beer, and one looks like a dark red wine. So
Yeah.
if you want to remember it that way, it works good. And I'm
Yeah.
doing that donation because you're doing double red donation at the same time. So
Yeah.
you're
Yeah, we could all afford to lose 2 pints of red cells. We just can't afford to lose 2 pints of red cells plus 2 pints of serum. We'll go if we draw that much blood out of folks. So, yeah, that's what they're doing. They're separating it and they're giving you the plasma, the serum, back.
Yeah, and you guys see it actually. You'll see the two.
Yeah.
So you'll look over.
We will see it here in lab because we will take some blood and spin it down, and you'll see what I've drawn there when we get to the blood chapter. It's pretty interesting stuff. But then I kind of think all of this is pretty interesting. So the white cells are leukocytes, and the last ones are the little guys called platelets, and they're really tiny compared to all the cells. And what are platelets for? They make your blood clot. Platelets, I like to think of them as little guys that float around in there, and when it's time to clot, they kind of grab onto each other and form a solid clot. There's more to it than that, but we also call the platelets I'll come back to it. I want to say erythrocytes, but that's not right. It'll come up. No. Hemoglobin is the red proteins that are in the red cells. I'm just trying to think of the name for platelets. Cytohemocyanin. Okay.
Thrombocytes?
Thrombocytes, thank you. That's what it is, thrombocytes. Why? Because they form thrombuses. Thrombuses are clot, and so we call them thrombocytes. Thank you. Okay, let's talk about the fluid elements of connective tissues. Now, obviously, in the blood, this is just watery stuff, the fluid elements. The watery stuff would be this part, the upper part, the plasma or the serum. We can pretty much use those terms interchangeably, although they're a little bit different. We'll get to that later. So plasma is the liquid that's in blood. Interstitial fluid is the little bit of fluid that is between all the cells in our body. Okay? So if you're in the skin even, and here's the basement membrane, and here's a bunch of cells that are going to turn into squamous cells by the time they get up here to the top. But these cells down here are pretty cuboidal. But in between every cell, there's a little bit of fluid, the interstitial fluid. And sometimes it doesn't seem like that would really amount to much, but actually it's one of the larger amounts of water in our body, just because it's around every single cell. And so there's fluid inside the cell, which we call intracellular. That's inside the cell. And then in between it, we have the intercellular, and we also call that interstitial fluid. The third collection of fluid in our body is the lymph. The lymph is the fluid that does not have any red cells in it. It's very clear. It does have a few white cells in it, but it's picked up in the lymph vessels down in your feet and brought all the way back up to your chest and then put back in your bloodstream to remove all that extra interstitial fluid. So here's a quickie. Red cells. Red cells always have this funny shape. It's called a biconcave disc. It means they're concave on each side, which means they go in. Biconcave disc. You've seen examples in your earlier training about sickle cells. People that have a defect in their hemoglobin and have sickle cell anemia, their cells will actually sickle up and look like a thin sickle, especially when they go into crisis. The white cells are illustrated here. There's a bunch of them. You don't have to know the difference between them at this point. We will when we get to the blood chapter. But basically, they're really pretty easy, just so you know. Basophils have blue granules in them, basic blue. Eosinophils are red, red. Neutrophils are kind of neutral in between. These are basically the white cells that fight infection that we count all the time. We count them all, actually. Lymphocytes play a role in immunity, allow us to be immune to different things. We'll learn about them more. And monocytes is another one. So, these are the platelets. In relation to this picture here, I think platelets are a little bit smaller than that. They've drawn them a little bit bigger than they should be. But you'll see them under the microscope. When you look at a blood smear, you should look at a blood smear at this point. Not to try to differentiate all the different kinds of white cells, but just to look at what a white cell looks like. And this is the one time in A&P that I think you just kind of have to use oil immersion if you're trying to identify the different types of white cells. You really need a lot of magnification to be able to look at a cell and say that's a neutrophil or that's a basophil. And by the way, when I look at white cells, I can only identify about 2/3 of them because some of them kind of crossed the line. They didn't take up the stain quite right, so the eosinophils aren't as red as they should be, or or the basophils didn't pick up as much stain, so they don't look very blue. They look more like the neutrophils kind of in between. So don't worry, we're not here to make blood technicians out of you and make you be able to identify all the types. But you should be able to just look at a couple of white cells and see them. Okay, let's talk about this lymph for just a minute. The lymph is a form of extracellular fluid. It's outside of the cells. Do you think there's more fluid outside of the cells or inside of the cells in the whole body? Inside, that's right. The cells themselves contain this fluid, which is intracellular. And remember that even this area right down here, all these blood cells, that's all intracellular fluid because it's living inside those blood cells, right? Lymph, on the other hand, is collecting this extracellular fluid, mostly coming out of the interstitial space. The lymph system flows through the lymph nodes. You've probably heard of lymph nodes. It monitors the fluid that runs through it, and it's transported from the legs. It comes up, joins into a single duct called the thoracic duct. We'll get to this later. But it runs up through the back of the chest and then dumps into the jugular subclavian vein junction over here in the neck and goes back into the bloodstream. You've probably all heard of a patient who had breast cancer, for example, and they get the good news back a week later that their lymph nodes were negative. And what does that mean? It means that it hasn't gone to the blood. Well, it hasn't gone to the lymph. It hasn't been. The cancer cells, what makes cancer cancer is it metastasizes, it wants to spread, and when it does, it breaks off little bitty cells, and those cells are usually picked up by the lymph system, and the lymph system carries them to a lymph node, and hopefully the lymph node destroys the cancer cells, and that's the end of it. But sometimes the lymph nodes get overwhelmed with too many cancer cells, and then the cancer takes up roost in the lymph nodes. So after a lady has a breast cancer operation, we usually remove some of the lymph nodes under their armpit. The pathologist looks at it under the microscope to see if any of the lymph nodes are involved with cancer. And although that doesn't tell you that the patient can't be cured, it tells you that the disease is more advanced. And if it's more advanced, they're going to get more treatment. They're going to get heavier doses of chemotherapy, more radiation or something. Okay? Anyway, this fluid is eventually returned back to the venous system and then peed out, basically, through the kidneys. We have two systems of tubes that run through our body. One is called the cardiovascular system. That's your blood system. It has both arteries that carry the blood away from the heart, and it has veins that bring the blood back to the heart. And obviously the blood goes round and round about every minute and 40 seconds or so. The blood makes a complete circulation through your body. On the other hand, the lymphatic system is just a one-way stream. You don't ever send fluid out through the lymphatic system. It's just an input system. So it only runs in one direction through these lymphatic vessels. They don't have a pump or anything. The only thing that pumps the lymphatic system is like when you walk and you contract, your muscles contract, that pushes on the outside of the lymph vessels and causes the fluid to go up. And then there's a series of valves, so the fluid can go up, but it can't go back. It goes up to the next valve, can't go back. It goes up, can't go back. So there's a system of valves in the lymphatic system is what keeps everything going in the same direction. And I will tell you that in 30 years of surgery, I saw lymphatic vessels maybe 4 or 5 times. They're so tiny that with the naked eye, you just never see them. Sometimes you would see a bunch of lymph fluid, and patient that had their lymph system blocked off, but the lymph vessels themselves are so small you can't see them. You will see some in lab under the microscope. We have some slides that show that to you, but just remember they're very, very small. Yes?
Some people that are on the list
People that are on Lasix are really getting rid of their blood, the serum, but that involves some of the lymph as well. Yeah. Lasix poisons their kidneys, so they can't reabsorb the water, so the water just goes out. Called the diuretic. Interesting. They give Lasix to horses, thoroughbred horses. That's the #1 cheater drug in horse racing. In order to flush out that extra fluid, because horses will actually go into heart failure while running for 3 minutes. It's so abnormal for them to run that fast, that hard, that their hearts fail. So if you can give them some extra Lasix and flush out some extra fluid, they won't get heart failure. Isn't that weird? People find ways to cheat at everything. All right. Let's talk about the supportive connective tissues. That's the next kind of group of connective tissues, and that is basically bone and cartilage. Okay? Now, bone and cartilage are sort of closely related, but they are very, very different. And let's just touch on it briefly here. We're going to come back to them when we get to the bone chapter in much more detail. But cartilage is a gel-like substance that has ground substance, which ground substance is the stuff in between the cells, remember? But in cartilage, instead of it just being liquid like it was in the loose areolar tissue, it's now gel. It's pretty tough gel. How many of you have seen gristle when you eat chicken bone? That's cartilage. That's the cartilage. And so it's kind of thick, but you can break it. You could chew it up if you wanted to. It's not very tasty at all. The muscles are much more tasty than cartilage. Cartilage is a shock absorber. And so we have cartilage in our knees so that every time we run, we have this little pad of cartilage in there that can expand and contract a little bit. And so that's really the main reasons for cartilage. There's cartilage on the end of every bone. It's very slicky stuff so that your joints can move. The bone, this is a bone, this is a bone, this is cartilage on the end of the bone, so it can move and slide around with cartilage on it. Bone is calcified. That's why it shows up so nicely on x-rays. It's made rigid by calcium salts. Saw an article on the news last night that said you don't need to take all your calcium pills because it probably doesn't help. The best thing for maintaining bone strength is weight bearing. It is lifting weights. It is doing exercise that involves weight resistance. If you lift weights, your bones get the idea, wait a minute, I gotta lift all this stuff. I better get stronger, and that's what they do. So the best thing for your bones is weightlifting. Anyway, basically bones are for weight support. That's what allows us to stand up straight. It's also what allows us to move everything because our muscles are attached to our bones, and then when the muscle contracts, it makes the bones move. We'll learn a lot about that. Cartilage is made up of this major matrix. The matrix of cartilage is a bunch of proteins called proteoglycans, that are derived from chondroitin sulfate. This is a name you need to know, chondroitin sulfate and proteoglycans probably. These are the two chemicals that form most of the clear parts of cartilage. Okay, so that's what they're really made of. The cartilage cells are created by chondroblasts, which is not listed here, but we'll talk about it anyway. Chondroblasts make cartilage. Chondrocytes take care of the cartilage. They become the cartilage cells. Now, the way that really works is you got this little cell that lives in a little hole called a lacunae, and that cell takes care of the cartilage that's around it. Keeps the sugar levels, the protein levels, the pH, all that stuff where it's supposed to be. So chondrocytes live in lacunaes. We'll give you an example pictures here in a second. One thing about cartilage is it has no blood vessels, which means that if you tear a cartilage in your knee, it's not going to repair itself. Cartilage doesn't really repair itself. Once it's ruined, and usually most arthroscopic surgeries on the knee and so forth, you're going in there to cut out and remove the cartilage so that you don't have the edges of it that get caught in your knee when it moves and it doesn't hurt you and so forth. I've had both of my knees operated on to take out cartilages. It's the most common operation in America. Orthopedic operation. Yes.
So what does glucosamine do then?
What?
Glucosamine.
Glucosamine.
You said it doesn't repair itself, but
Yeah, glucosamine is just trying to make it get stronger. Make the cartilage stronger before you tear it. Does it really help? I don't know. I'm a real skeptic of almost all food nutrition supplements. First of all, most of them have never been tested in a randomized, prospective way. You give the drug to one group, you don't give the drug to the other group, and neither group knows whether they're getting it or not. And then you see, you have ways to measure it, and that's never been done on any of these supplements at all. People always want to think they work. We all want to think that everything we take is good for us, right? And so if you take glucosamine, you're suddenly thinking, oh man, I just got so much more energy and my bones are working so much better and my cartilage is working. Be very skeptical of all that stuff because it usually comes with a pretty hefty price tag. Somebody's making money on it. The reason I mention this is that cartilage doesn't have any blood vessels. And that's because the chondrocytes produce an anti-angiogenesis factor. Now, once again, there's a word that you think, oh my God, what a long word. How can I ever understand that? Well, anti means it fights. Angiogenesis means it makes blood vessels. Genesis means to create. Angio means blood vessels. So there's plenty of anti-angiogenesis factor in cartilage to keep them from developing blood vessels. There are no blood vessels in cartilage. On the outside of cartilage, however, we do have this tough layer that gives it strength called perichondrium. There's an inner layer that has some cells on the inside of the perichondrium around the chondrocytes that does bring blood to the cartilage, but it has to diffuse all the way into the cartilage because there are no blood vessels running out through the cartilage itself. Yes?
So is that why, like, a lot of the times, like, if you do have cartilage damage and they've already done surgery and are still having, like, pain and stuff, is that why they do, like, O3 treatments? Like ozone?
I have no idea. What they're probably trying to do there is if they've taken out the cartilage, like in your knee, what they're trying to do is to save the cartilage, the hyaline cartilage that you have that lives on the end of your bones, so that it's not rubbing on your bones. That's what really arthritis is when the little layer of cartilage that normally appears on the end of the bones disappears. When they did my arthroscopy, they took out the cartilage and they said, you've already had some damage to your cartilage on the bone itself, and they recommended that I not run anymore. I used to run run 8 marathons back in the day. And ever since they told me that, I've never run again. I do non-impact things. I ride my bike. I elliptical trainer. I do lots of exercise classes that don't involve jumping up and down on my knees, because I know that's already been damaged and it's only going to get worse. And if I go get on a treadmill and run for an hour, my knees will be killing me the next day. Yeah.
Just random. I've had lots of knee surgeries, and last one is they actually took bone marrow from my hip, stem cells from my arm, and it created cartilage in my knee.
Wow.
So, because they told me I couldn't run when I was a soccer player, but the problem was they couldn't control how much it grew. So now I can feel it, but
So it overgrew.
yeah, they could shave it down,
Yeah.
but it's kind of cool that way.
Yeah.
They called it like a fibrinogen patch.
Yep.
Stick on. I have a picture. We should bring that.
Cool. Bring it in. I could learn something. I don't know about that. I never did orthopedic surgery.
Now I can run 3 miles and then get paid.
There you go. Quick example of how cartilage grows, and I have a little video posted on D2L. I may have to bring it up for you. Here's a chondrocyte, really here, and it's living in a lacunae. This is the matrix. This blue area is all the cartilage, which is made up of the proteoglycans, chondroitin sulfate. That really is what you think of as the cartilage itself. These cells split, as illustrated here, and then they move apart. They start making new matrix, and then it allows more cartilage to be formed. The other way that cartilage grows is from the edges, from the outside. So here's the perichondrium on the outside of the cartilage. The stem cells divide into chondroblasts, and they start making more cartilage and are gradually separated away, and we actually get more and more cartilage being built up in that way. These are basically the ways that cartilage is formed in early development in kiddos. Just so you know, kiddos up until about the age of 4, children don't really have much in the way of bone in their body. Everything is cartilage. That's why it's really hard to break kids' bones, because cartilage does tend to flex. And whenever you see a kid that has a broken bone, you got to think really hard. Child abuse. Very, very difficult for a kid to break a bone unless somebody took it. And no matter which part of medicine you go into, and me as a teacher, we're all required reporters. And you can lose your license for not reporting suspected child abuse. You don't have to investigate it. You don't have to do anything about it. You've just got to call the state and say, I've got a suspicion that there's child abuse here. And I can tell you, every night in the emergency room, nurses would come to me and come to other people in the ER and say, do you think this is suspicious? And, your job is to report. So you just call the DHS office, and they would send an investigator up. They would review the whole case, review all the x-rays and everything. Then they would decide, and if they thought it was child abuse, that kid was coming out of that home for a while at least. So child abuse is a terrible thing. You can't imagine anybody doing it, but they do. And we as the healthcare system are really the only protection that kids have. So keep that in mind. Let's talk about cartilage. There's 3 types of cartilage. Oh man, there's 3 types of everything, isn't there? Hyaline cartilage is pretty stiff. It's the stuff you find on the ends of all your bones, on the tips of your ribs, in your sternum, in your trachea. We will look at a bunch of hyaline cartilage under the microscope. It's by far and away the most common kind of cartilage. Elastic cartilage is only found really in 2 places, the external ear and the epiglottis. Epiglottis is the little flapper valve that keeps you from swallowing food down into your trachea. It's also in your ear out here. The nice thing about that is your ear can bend, but yet it can also come back to normal shape when you let it go. So it's cartilage, but it bends easily and it has a lot of elastic fibers in it. Fibrous cartilage is called fibrocartilage. That's the cartilage that's in your knees, that the meniscus, you've probably heard somebody had an operation on their middle meniscus or their lateral meniscus. That's made up of fibrocartilage. It's very tough stuff. It's cartilage as well. It's also found here where your pubic bones join and in your intervertebral discs, the disc that's in between each vertebrae. That's made of fibrocartilage. It's very, very tough, but yet it's sort of rigid as well. And we'll look at that under the microscope as well. Quickly here, here's hyaline cartilage. It kind of looks like this. You need to look at this in the lab. And just know that the cells that live in cartilage are called chondrocytes, as we've already mentioned. The elastic cartilage, for example, in your ear looks like this under the microscope, and the major difference is there's just tons of elastic fibers running through it as well that stand as dark, thin lines, just like elastic cartilage does in any other tissue. And the third one is fibrocartilage, which fibrocartilage in your knee and also here in the intervertebral discs between the bones in your back. Yes, ma'am?
But you should have hyaline cartilage and fibrous cartilage in your knee, right? Because like it is
Yes, you do.
also like a synovial joint.
Well, if this is your tibia here, and here's your femur up here, there's a layer of hyaline cartilage on the end of the bones right there, and on the end of this bone. In the knee, there's then a big piece of fibrocartilage that's sitting out here in the middle. That is that meniscus thing we talked about. So this is fibrocartilage here. This is hyaline cartilage here. Yes, there's both kinds in the knee. Okay, now let's talk about bone for a minute. And remember that we're coming back to bone in the next couple chapters when we study the bones. But you need to know something about it now. Bone is very strong. It doesn't break as easily. It doesn't bend like cartilage does. It really does resist shattering. There is a fair amount of bend even in bones. But obviously, if you bend it enough, it breaks and you have broken bones. But it doesn't shatter like a piece of glass. You don't tap your knee or tap your femur and it breaks into 27,000 pieces like your windshield does. And that's a good thing. The bone is made up of, it's a very specific organization pattern to it we'll talk about. Basically, bone cells are called osteocytes. They're arranged around those central canals in the bone. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And then there's these little canaliculi that access blood supply because bone is a living thing. Bone needs blood supply. It has blood vessels running all through it. That's why when you break a bone, you bleed a lot. You bleed a lot because bone has lots of blood running through it. All of you have eaten chicken leg and you eat all the bone off and you're still kind of hungry and you kind of take it and break it, and that's, you can see the blood in the middle of it. That's the bone marrow. Of course, it's already been fried and cooked at 440 degrees for 15 minutes or something, so it's not quite the normal appearance. But yeah, bone has lots of blood in it, and it also has a very tough cover around the outside of it, same as cartilage had a perichondrium. This has a periosteum. Periosteum is very tough stuff. It has both a fibrous layer on the outside, which is very, very tough, and a cellular layer on the inside that helps take care of the bone that lives right underneath there. When you break a bone, the reason that it hurts so bad, and it really does, a broken bone hurts a lot. The reason it hurts is because you've torn the periosteum. When you broke the bone, you tore the periosteum. The periosteum, this coating on the outside of the bone, is where all the blood vessels come into the bone, and it's also where all the nerves come into the bone. So we have lots of little nerves running through the periosteum, and that's why it hurts so bad. Here's the organization of bone, and you'll look at this under the microscope. We have several really nice models over in the lab of how bone is organized. But looking at it right here, you see that on the outside is the periosteum over here on the far right. You notice there's two layers. The outer layer is this fibrous layer, which is really tough. For example, you take that chicken bone and you break it, and then there's still a layer of tough fibrous stuff, and you kind of pull it apart and it kind of stretches, and there's this little stringy thing going between. That's the periosteum. It's been fried and cooked, so it's not near as tough as it was when the chicken was alive, but it's still stringy. That's the periosteum that you're seeing. Notice that the bone has lots of these layers of called lamellae of bone tissue. These are the osteocytes right here. These little cells that occur in layers around a central canal, runs down through the middle of the bone, not just the middle of the bone, but all through the bone matrix itself, has arteries and vessels in it, arteries and veins to carry blood up into the bone and out. Then there's little blood vessels that go out sideways because the blood has to get to these osteocytes. They have to have oxygen. Every cell in your body has to be able to get oxygen. Now, the way cartilage gets oxygen is it just diffuses in the interstitial fluid and gets to the chondrocytes. But in the bone, there's lots more blood, and the oxygen diffuses out through here. Now, all of these lines that are going in this direction are what we call canaliculi. They are extensions of the cytoplasm of these osteocytes right here. And what that means is they have these little fingers of cytoplasm that reach out so that the oxygen and carbon dioxide and waste materials and sugar can diffuse through them in order to supply all of this area out here. But this osteocyte, basically its job is to take care of the cells right around it, and that's what they all do. Let's talk about membranes for just a second. We started off talking about them back in the first day of class because we talked about all the body cavities. Those are lined by membranes. But membranes are also on the outside, so they either line or cover portions of the body. I think that makes sense. You can almost think of them as they are all epithelial tissues because they're either covering something or lining something. And they consist of an epithelium supported by connective tissues. So you remember that peritoneum that we were looking at, the stuff that lines the inside of the belly? Well, that's a membrane, and it's mostly just an epithelium, one cell thick, squamous, simple squamous epithelium, but it's got a bunch of connective tissues underneath it that make it tough. And indeed, the peritoneum is tough enough that you can actually sew it at surgery, sew up the peritoneum to help seal it all off. There's 4 basic types of membranes. Mucous membranes, guess what they do? They secrete mucus, right? So an example of a mucous membrane would be the inside of your colon. Okay, that secretes a lot of mucus. Serous membranes secrete serum, real watery. So the example of that would be like the peritoneum that we were just talking about. That's a serous membrane. It doesn't really make mucus. There's just a little bit of fluid that it makes in order to allow things to slide around in there. The cutaneous membrane is a fancy name for skin. Okay, so the skin is a cutaneous membrane. We'll learn a lot more about that next chapter. And then there are synovial membranes. Synovial membranes line the inside of all your joints, your synovial cavities. And synovial membranes are incredibly slippery. The fluid inside of the joints it's just amazing how slippery it is. Did anybody ever work in a gas station, ever use STP? It's this oil treatment stuff that's so incredibly slippery. You put it in your oil, it's supposed to make your car run better. I don't know if it gets sold much these days. It did a lot back in the 60s and 70s when I was working in gas stations. Anyway, when we were doing surgery, just as an example of how slippery the synovial membranes are, we might be operating on somebody who'd been in a bad trauma accident and they were all beat up, and you'd be operating along, and suddenly you couldn't hold the instruments. Your hands were so greasy, oily, you couldn't hold the instruments, and there was nothing to do but go change gloves, get another set of gloves. But what that really told us was that one of the synovial cavities was ripped open, and we were dealing with synovial fluid in the wound. And so then you had to go looking and trying to find where the torn synovial cavity was. If it was possible, you'd want to sew that back up. But once the synovial tissue, the synovial fluid got out into the tissues, it was just so oily and slippery, just couldn't do much of anything with it. Synovial membranes. Mucous membranes, I already mentioned them before. They line any passageway that has an external connection. So mucous membranes completely line the digestive, respiratory, urinary, reproductive tract. The surface of all of these things has to be moist all the time to allow things to slide through and reduce friction. The lamina propria is the name for the area just below the basement membrane. The basement membrane, remember, is the layer that all the epithelial cells attach to. And remember, the epithelial layers are avascular. There's no blood vessels up there. But the lamina propria, which lives just below the basement membrane, has lots of blood vessels in it. And that's where the epithelium gets its blood supply. Serous membranes open line cavities that don't open to the outside, so that would be like the pleural cavity, pericardial cavity, and so forth. They all have a parietal portion and a visceral portion. I think I beat that to death enough. Three serous membranes, three examples are the pleura, surrounding the lungs, the peritoneum, lining the belly, and the pericardium, which lines the pericardial cavity and covers the heart. Just kind of diagrams here that I think are helpful. A mucous membrane would look like this. Here's the epithelium on the outside. A lot of times it has either villi or cilia on the top, but notice that it has a bunch of mucus cells, goblet cells from time to time that are secreting mucus, and that's why it's called a mucous membrane. Serous membrane would be like the three cavities that we just mentioned. It's a squamous, simple squamous epithelium. Oftentimes it secretes a little bit of fluid, clear serous fluid, and they call that this transudate here on the outside. It's just fluid that weeped out of the cells. And then underneath it you see there's a relar tissue, the thin connective tissue, not the non-dense connective tissue proper, the areolar tissue, whatever you want to call it. Same in this one and in that one up there. The cutaneous membrane is the skin. Synovial membranes are the joints. Real quick, this is what skin kind of looks like. Here's the basement membrane running like that. The cells are very cuboidal down here at the bottom, but we name them from the ones up on top. So this is stratified squamous epithelium for your skin. Notice that right below it there's this areolar tissue, which is kind of loose connective tissue, but deep down there's this dense irregular tissue, which is really what makes your skin tough, that allows you to pull on it and so forth and have it not rip. The synovial membrane, this is a joint. Here's a bone here and a bone there. You notice there's hyaline cartilage on the end of all the bones. And then there's this is the synovial cavity, which is full of synovial fluid in there. And the synovial membrane runs around the outside. notice that the synovial membrane does not extend up and over the cartilage inside. It just surrounds the outside. I find this a really hard thing to talk about here because it talks about what holds the body together. Basically, I think you best learn this in lab. These connective tissues that we talked about, the things that connect things together, also provide a route for blood vessels, for lymphatic vessels, and for nerves. So in between all the muscles, in between all the fascia levels and so forth, there are connective tissues. Fascia, the plural is fascia, F-A-S-C-I-A-E. The singular form is fascia. It surrounds all of the muscles, all of the organs to some degree or another. It's kind of a general term, which means tough connective tissue. As you go down through the body, you'll find 3 levels of fascia. I don't find this very helpful either. But the superficial fascia is that fascia we just talked about that's in the skin. The deeper fascias is once you get all the way through the skin and you get down to, say, a muscle, there'll be fascia on it. But, well, the fascias are usually tougher. They're kind of the whitish sheets that you see. Yeah, exactly. And then the loose stuff is what connects is between one muscle and another. And then there's the subserous fascia, and what that means is that's the deepest layer of fascia right above the cavity, for example, the abdominal cavity. Just above the perineum, there's another layer of fascia, which is described there. So if you're going through somebody's chest, and going into this is in the chest, it looked like this. There would be a layer of superficial fascia that's right out here in the skin and the fat. Then there would be several layers of deeper fascia here on the outside of that muscle, on the inside of that muscle, on the outside of that muscle, and on the inside of that muscle. Those are all layers of deep fascia that help hold us together. And then way down deep, there's the subserous fascia, which is just above the pleura in this case. The pleura would be the inner lining in the chest. And I'll just leave it at that. I think these are things you see as you dissect, and it kind of tries to categorize them, but I think it makes too big a deal of it. I wouldn't expect to see me putting pointers on things and say, is this a deep fascia or is this a subserous subserosal fascia? These are just general terms. Okay. First type of tissues was epithelial. Second was connective. We're now done with those 2. Now we're down to the last 2, which are really pretty easy because there's so much. There's just a few of them. Last one's nerves, remember. As far as muscle is concerned, muscle does nothing but contract. That's its only job, is to shorten. Okay. So this muscle here, when I signal it to contract, it contracts, and when it does, it pulls on this bone and pulls it up. Allows us movement of all of our things. The biggest bunch of muscles in our body, and indeed probably a little over almost a third to half of our body mass, is made up of skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle are all these big muscles that we eat. Okay? So when you go to the grocery store and you're looking at hamburger or you're looking at steak, you're looking at skeletal muscle. Okay? A hamburger is ground up, so there's a lot of gristle and fascia and fat probably in there as well, mixed together. And it's the fat that makes it tasty, by the way. So the most expensive cuts of meat are the ones that have lots of fat running through them. Wait till you get to your cat, you'll see the difference. Some of them, and that's the difference between wild meat and farm-raised meat usually, is that wild meat has very little fat in it, so therefore it tastes different, and it's much drier. And I guess healthier for you because it doesn't have as much fat. All right, so that's skeletal muscle. There's 3 types of muscles. Skeletal muscle Cardiac muscle, that's an easy one because it's only found in one place. That's in the heart. And all it does is just contract all the time. Never stops, never rests, never gets tired. From the minute you're born until the minute you die, your heart is beating. And the third one is the smooth muscle, which is found in the walls of all of your hollow organs, such as blood vessels, your urinary bladder, your respiratory system. That's what makes your breathing tubes contract down and gives you asthma if they contract down too much. In your digestive system, that's what makes you, it's the wall, the smooth muscle lives in the wall of the stomach. That's what causes your stomach to munch, to mix up your food. And then it also pushes the food down your small intestine into your large intestine. But that's all smooth muscle. You don't find any big chunks of smooth muscle, okay? Usually all you see is a thin little layer around the outside of the stomach or a thin little layer around the outside of the small intestine. Don't be looking for big muscles like these guys. Also in the reproductive tract, your oviducts contract and power the egg on down into the uterus. There's smooth muscle in the walls of the vas deferens and all the organs in the male that push the sperm out. And then, thank goodness, there's smooth muscle in the wall of the uterus that pushes the baby out at the end when that thing is properly cooked. Here's some factors that you need to know about the three kinds of muscle to tell them apart. I can probably make a little chart real quick here on the three kinds of muscle. Let's just do it. So the biggest one is skeletal, and the next one is cardiac, and the next one is smooth. Okay? Okay, striated. Striated means striped. Okay, so when you look at the muscle under the microscope, it looks like it has stripes on it. We'll explain why that is and show you that as we get through it. But basically, the types of muscle that are striated are skeletal and cardiac. These are both striped. Smooth muscle is not striated. Okay? Muscle cells can have a single nucleus. Well, that's true of smooth muscle. It has a single nucleus. Skeletal muscle has thousands of nuclei in each muscle cell. Cardiac muscle also has just one. Muscle, so that's so you either have a single nucleus or you're multinucleate, have a lot of nuclei. Muscle cells can be controlled voluntarily. Well, I can control my skeletal muscles, right? I can tell them when to contract and so forth. I can't tell my heart when to contract, and I can't tell my stomach when to squeeze and digest my food. So, voluntary. Skeletal muscle, yes. Cardiac muscle, no. Smooth muscle, no. We're going to add a few more things to that chart before we get done here, but we'll start with those. Now the slides go through the different types of muscle. Skeletal muscle is very long. Very thin. A muscle cell, a single cell, can go from one end of this muscle all the way to the top of the muscle. So the cells can be huge, very long. They're thin, but they're long, and they have lots and lots. Like I said over here, they can have thousands of nuclei. Muscle cells are actually called muscle fibers. And like I said, a muscle fiber can go from one end of the muscle to the other end. That's one cell, that's one muscle fiber. They do not divide. When Arnold Schwarzenegger goes on a training session and turns from the skinny little governor into this big, huge muscle guy, he doesn't make any more muscle cells. He just makes the ones he has get bigger. He fills them up with fluid and all that other stuff, makes them, strains them, makes them bigger, but he doesn't make more of them. There are some stem cells in the muscle that can make new cells, but that's very rare. It usually only occurs when they get damaged, when there's damage done to the area. They're called myosatellite cells. So here's what skeletal muscle looks like. It's very long. This is a single fiber. It has nuclei. Here's nucleus, and I would say over here, nuclei in the center of the cell. And I would say for skeletal muscle, as you can see, the answer is no. The nuclei are always at the edge. For cardiac muscle, it's yes, they are in the center. I'll just write center here. And for smooth muscle, I'll also write yes. The nuclei are always in the center of the cells. Cardiac muscle cells, quickly, are called cardiocytes. I don't know why you need to know that, but anyway. The thing that's interesting about cardiac muscle cells is they have these things called intercalated discs. And I'll write that over here. Intercalated discs. And intercalated discs are what attach one cell to the next one. And it attaches them very tightly. But if you ask me what's an intercalated disc, I would say an intercalated disc is the thing that holds two cardiac cells together, and it unites them both chemically and mechanically, actually holds them together, and structurally or electrically. And the reason that works that way is because we want our cardiac cells to all squeeze together. Okay? The way our heart pumps is that the entire heart if it's doing this, it's not pumping anything. And you're probably fibrillating and you're probably dead. But the point being, the way our heart works is it all works together. So these intercalated discs connect the cells together so that they all fire at the same time. And because it attaches them structurally, they're hooked to each other. So when one squeezes, it drags along the next one and so forth. So we do not see those in skeletal muscle. We do see those in cardiac muscle. We do not see them in smooth muscle. Smooth muscle cells are small and tapered. We call that spindle-shaped. In other words, the cells look like this. The nucleus is in the middle, not only in the middle lengthwise, but in the middle. They're small and tapered. They can divide and regenerate. So if you wanted to put spindle shape down here, you would say that skeletal muscles are not spindle-shaped. Cardiac muscles are not, and smooth muscles, yes. One last thing I would add to my list is branched. And you'll notice that this is a cardiac muscle. These are cardiac muscles right here, and muscle cells. And you notice that there's a single nucleus for each cell. That nucleus is in the center, not on the edge like the skeletal muscles. But also notice that the cells are branched, okay? So cardiac muscle cells are branched. And you notice these little lines here. These are the intercalated discs. Now, I'll tell you that you see intercalated discs on some slides down in the lab and you don't on others, but we have some slides that are just wonderful. It shows them so perfectly. And they can look like this, okay? And that's the connection between this cell and that cell. Okay, so I'll put branched down there. And the only one that is branched is cardiac. Yes. No. No. This is an example of smooth muscle tissue. Notice it's just a bunch of spindle-shaped cells together. Nothing's lined up. It's not striated at all. And there are no intercalated discs and so forth. In 2 seconds, I'm going to tell you about nervous tissue. It's the fourth type. We don't really talk about it much now. Basically, nervous tissue is just made for one thing, and that is for conducting electrical impulses. The way everything works in all of our nerves is we send these electric shocks down the nerve, and it connects to another nerve, which then connects to another nerve. And when I look out at your face and say, and how do I know that's a face? I know that because I've looked at it, my eye sees a face. It has seen a whole lot of faces in my life. It has these patterns of shocks, of little nerve cells that when they're stimulated in a certain order, based on the light that's coming into my eye, I recognize that as a face. And so that's it's all done with shocks. Weird. Most of it's found in the brain and the spinal cord. There's basically two types of cells in the nervous system. The only one that really counts is, well, I won't say that. Neurons are the nerve cells. Neuroglia are the supporting cells. Basically, these are the ones that do all the work of our thinking and working as nerves. These are the ones that just support them. If you look in our brain, about half of the cells are neurons, and the other half support them. The parts of a neuron, you should know, we have some nice models in the lab. Basically, this is the cell body, or the main part of the nerve. It has a whole bunch of little short things on this side called dendrites. Dendrites are the ones that receive the shocks coming in from other nerve cells, for example. They come in here, and then they get processed, and they go down this long thing. And this part of the nerve cell can be this long. You have one nerve cell that goes from the tip of your toe all the way up to your spinal cord. So these things can be very long, and that's called the axon. Some cells in your brain will touch with 250,000 other cells. They have that many little dendrites that allow them to connect together and allow you to form these crazy thoughts that you get at night. I think I'll stop right here. I think there's just a very few slides left, but we'll finish that up next time. Okay, we'll meet in lab at noon. We'll have a little quiz over there, which I think you'll find fun.